My daughter-in-law called me on a Tuesday afternoon, which I thought was odd because she never called me directly. She always went through my son. When I saw her name on the screen, I almost didn't answer. "Dad," she said. She'd called me Dad since the wedding 12 years ago. "I need you to listen carefully and not say anything until I'm done." My heart dropped before she spoke another word. "Lawrence has been moving money out of your accounts. I found the transfers 3 days ago. I didn't know what to do. I'm telling you now because it's gotten worse. A lot worse. Please don't call him yet. Just get to your bank first thing tomorrow morning and freeze everything." I stood in my garage holding a socket wrench I'd been using to fix a neighbor's lawnmower, and I felt the floor tilt under me. Not from shock, exactly. Somewhere deep down, something that had been whispering to me for months just got loud enough to hear clearly. I've been trying not to listen to it. My name is Harold, and I turned 64 in March. I spent 31 years working as a structural engineer, building bridges across the mid-Atlantic. When people ask what I did for a living, I always say the same thing. I made sure things didn't fall apart. There's some irony in that now. My wife Ruth passed from ovarian cancer 6 years ago. We had 40 years together, raised 2 boys in a house at the edge of a small town in western Pennsylvania. The older one is Lawrence. The younger one is my son Craig, who lives in Phoenix with his wife and my 3 grandchildren, and who I don't see nearly enough. After Ruth died, the grief was something I won't try to fully describe here. What I'll say is that it changed the shape of everything: the house, the days, the way I moved through time. I kept working on cars in the garage because the work made sense when nothing else did. I kept cooking dinner at 6 o'clock, even when there was no one else at the table, because that's what we'd always done. Routine was a kind of survival. Lawrence and his wife Amber had been living 40 minutes away. After about a year, Lawrence started coming by more often. At first, I was grateful. He'd sit at the kitchen table, drink my coffee, and talk. It felt good to have someone in the house again. He started helping with bills. "Dad, just let me set up automatic payments. It's easier." And I agreed because I was tired and because I trusted him. I'd watched that boy grow up. I'd taught him to drive in an empty parking lot behind the old Sears. I'd sat with him in the hospital when Amber had their first miscarriage. He was my son. He suggested I give him a power of attorney when I had a minor health scare, some irregular heartbeats that turned out to be nothing serious. "Just in case," he said. "So if something happens and you can't make decisions, someone can act for you." That seemed reasonable. I signed it. Over the next 2 years, Lawrence gradually became the person who handled my financial life. It happened so slowly I barely noticed each individual step. He managed my pension deposits, my investments, the property tax on the house. He paid contractors when I needed roof work done. I trusted him completely. He was family. He was my son. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that Amber had known for over a year, that she'd seen the transfers, questioned Lawrence about them, and been told it was estate planning, that she'd watched the amounts grow from a few thousand to tens of thousands, that she'd been afraid of what Lawrence might do if she interfered. What finally broke her silence was a wire transfer of $42,000 to an account she didn't recognize, made the same week Lawrence told me the furnace needed replacing, and that he'd already paid the contractor. There was no contractor. The furnace was fine. I was at the bank by 8:15 the next morning. I'd barely slept. I sat down with a woman in the accounts department named Patricia, not a name on my list. A real person who'd helped me set up my accounts when I'd first moved my banking there after Ruth died. And I asked her to pull up everything. She pulled it up. She went quiet. Though, in 22 months, approximately $237,000 had been moved out of my accounts. Pension deposits, proceeds from a modest investment account I'd been building since my 40s, and a draw against a home equity line that Lawrence had opened in my name without my knowledge or my signature, except that it did have my signature, because he'd had power of attorney and had used it. I sat in that chair looking at the numbers, and I thought about something Ruth used to say. She'd say, "Harold, you see what you want to see until you can't anymore." She said it gently, not as criticism, just as observation. She knew me. She knew I loved people thoroughly and forgave them easily and assumed the best until the evidence against it became impossible to ignore. The evidence was now impossible to ignore. The bank manager was brought in. He told me they were required to flag certain patterns, and that this account had been flagged internally 3 months ago, but that because transfers had been made under valid power of attorney, they had no grounds to freeze anything without my direction. I told him to freeze everything. I told him to revoke the power of attorney. He told me I'd need to see a lawyer for the latter, and that the bank could place a hold pending legal direction. I called Craig from the parking lot. I sat in my truck and told him everything I knew. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Dad," he said finally, "I need to tell you something." Craig had been a certified public accountant before he transitioned into financial compliance work for a mid-sized firm in Phoenix. He dealt with fraud cases professionally. He didn't investigate them himself. He worked on the regulatory side, making sure companies didn't get into trouble. But he knew the landscape. What he told me from the parking lot was that 6 weeks before this conversation, Lawrence had called him asking questions, theoretical questions Craig had thought at the time, about how estate assets get tracked after a parent's death, about what triggers probate, about how quickly accounts can be accessed when a power of attorney converts to executor authority. Craig had found the questions unusual, and had said so. Lawrence had laughed it off, said he was just trying to be prepared, said I wasn't getting any younger. Craig had let it go because he hadn't wanted to believe what his gut was telling him. Now he didn't have that option. "Call a lawyer today," Craig said. "Don't call Lawrence yet. Don't give him any indication you know. Get a lawyer first and find out where you stand legally." I called a lawyer that afternoon. Her name is Margaret. I'm allowed that one since it's my attorney, and I have enormous respect for her. And she's been practicing elder law and estate litigation for 26 years. She saw me at 4 o'clock the same day I called. I laid out everything: the power of attorney, the transfers, the home equity line, the forged, because that's what it was, she told me, regardless of the power of attorney language, draw against my equity. She listened with a legal pad in front of her and wrote things down in a handwriting I couldn't read from where I was sitting. When I finished, she set down her pen. "Mr. Harold," she said, "what your son did with that power of attorney significantly exceeded its legal scope. A standard POA for healthcare decisions does not authorize financial transactions of this nature. Do you have a copy of what you signed?" I did not have a copy. Lawrence had handled the paperwork. "That's all right. We'll get one. Here's what I want you to do between now and when we speak next. I want you to write down every interaction you can remember. Dates, amounts, what was said, who was present. Every conversation about money, every contractor, every payment he made or said he made. Everything. Can you do that?" I told her I could. I was a structural engineer for 31 years. I was very good at documentation. It took me 4 days to write it all down. 12 pages, handwritten, because I think better with a pen. I went through my email going back 2 years, found conversations with Lawrence about payments and repairs. I found one email where he'd told me the HVAC system had needed a part replaced and given me a total of $4,200, which he said he'd already paid out of pocket and would just take from the account. I had replied, "Sounds good, thanks." I found 3 emails like that. None of those repairs had actually occurred. I had talked to my actual HVAC technician, a man I've used for 9 years, and he confirmed he hadn't been out to the house in over 18 months. I also went back to Amber. This was the hardest conversation. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear immediately that she'd been crying. Not recently, that specific hollowness in a voice that comes from crying that stopped hours ago. "I'm not calling to blame you," I told her. A long exhale on her end. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "I was scared. Lawrence. He's not who I thought he was either, Dad. I need you to know that." She told me that Lawrence had become involved with a woman he'd met through work 18 months ago. That he had been, for lack of a better phrase, building a parallel life. The money, Amber believed, had gone primarily toward funding that other life. An apartment she hadn't known about. Trips she hadn't taken. She'd found out about the woman 2 months ago, and had been living in the house in a kind of stunned paralysis, trying to figure out what to do. when the wire transfer broke her open. She told me she had screenshots, financial statements she'd photographed from documents Lawrence left in his home office. She would send them to my lawyer. When I hung up, I sat in the living room in the dark for a long time. Not thinking, exactly. Just sitting. The kind of sitting that isn't rest. I thought about the time Lawrence was 11 and broke the garage window with a baseball and came to tell me before I'd even noticed it was broken. I'd been proud of that. I'd told Ruth, that boy will always tell the truth, even when it costs him. I'd believed it for 53 years. Craig flew in from Phoenix without being asked. He showed up on a Friday evening with a carry-on bag and a six-pack of the local beer he knew I liked and sat across from me at the kitchen table. The same table where Lawrence had drunk my coffee and talked about automatic payments and making things easier. I keep thinking, Craig said, about all the times I noticed something was off and talked myself out of it. I knew what he meant. I'd been doing the same accounting. There was a birthday dinner 2 years ago, he said. Lawrence picked up the check and made a big deal of it. I thought it was generous. Now I'm thinking, whose money was he spending? I didn't answer that. We both knew. Craig had taken 2 weeks of leave. He wanted to be there through whatever came next. And what came next was complicated. Margaret had filed for an emergency revocation of the power of attorney and a freeze on the home equity line pending fraud investigation. The bank had cooperated. Lawrence had not yet been formally notified, but the clock was running. On a Wednesday evening, Lawrence called me. His voice was normal. He asked how I was doing. He mentioned that he'd noticed the home equity account was showing a hold and asked if I'd gotten a notice from the bank about something. I'd talked to Margaret about this moment. She told me not to lie outright, not to reveal what I knew, and not to confirm anything beyond saying I was looking into a discrepancy. There was something flagged, I said. I'm looking into it. What kind of flagging? I'm not sure yet. My bank contact is checking on it. A pause. Short, but there. Okay, he said. Let me know if you need help figuring it out. I will, I said. I hung up and sat there with the phone in my hand. Craig looked at me from across the kitchen. I didn't say anything. Neither did he. Margaret called me 11 days later on a Thursday morning. I was in the garage working on a '68 Chevelle that belonged to a friend of mine, just the carburetor, a straightforward job, and I'd gotten grease on my hands when the phone rang. Mr. Harold, I need you to sit down somewhere. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and sat on the garage steps. I've received the financial forensics report. The total figure is $261,000. That includes the equity draw, which was made using a forged notarization. The notary's signature on that document is fraudulent. That's a separate criminal exposure beyond the civil fraud. I've been in contact with the district attorney's office. They want to move forward. I asked what that meant in practical terms. It means criminal charges. Wire fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, which is a specific statute in Pennsylvania, and forgery. Lawrence will be arrested. I wanted you to hear that from me before it happened, not from a news alert. I thanked her and sat there on the garage steps with the phone in my lap and the Chevelle half assembled in front of me. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. A profound exhaustion. Not anger, not satisfaction. Just the weight of what was true and had been true and that I'd been carrying longer than I'd understood. Lawrence was arrested on a Friday morning. Craig was with me. We didn't go anywhere. We sat in the house and waited, and Craig made eggs and we ate them without talking much. At 10:47, Margaret called to confirm it was done. Lawrence called me from his lawyer's office 3 days after the arrest. He'd made bail. His voice was different from the last time. Stripped of the casual confidence, smaller, like a voice coming from farther away. Dad, I need to explain. Then explain. He tried. He talked about pressure, about feeling like he'd gotten in over his head and then deeper and then too deep to stop. He talked about the woman. He said her name, which I won't repeat here, and about how he'd told himself it was temporary, that he'd pay it back, that he'd find a way to make it right, before I ever noticed. He said he'd been wrong. He said he was sorry. I let him talk. When he stopped, there was silence. Do you know what I did for 31 years? I said. He said he knew. I built things that held up people's lives. Roads they drove on. Bridges they crossed every day without thinking about it. I spent my career making sure that when people put their weight on something, it didn't give way. And you. I stopped. Took a breath. You used my name to steal from me. You used a document I signed because I trusted you, and you took what Ruth and I spent 40 years building together. He started to say something. I kept going. I don't want an explanation, Lawrence. An explanation tells me how. I already know why. You wanted money that wasn't yours, and you thought I was old enough and trusting enough that I wouldn't notice or wouldn't push back if I did. You saw your father the same way Jessica saw hers, as a resource, as something to be managed and used. He was quiet. Here's what happens now, I said. Your lawyer talks to Margaret. The process runs. I'm not dropping the criminal charges. I am not settling the civil suit for less than full restitution. When it's over, years from now, however long it takes, if you've done the work to become someone different, we can talk. But not now. Right now, you're still the man who forged my name and stole from your mother's memory as much as from me. He said, voice breaking, Dad, I'm still your son. Yes, I said. And that's the only reason this hurts as much as it does. I ended the call. Craig was sitting at the kitchen table. He'd heard enough to understand. He didn't say anything, which was the right thing. He just got up and put the kettle on. The legal process was slow and unremarkable in the way legal processes always are. A lot of documents, a lot of waiting, a lot of phone calls from Margaret with updates that required decisions. Lawrence's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea that would have reduced the financial exploitation charge in exchange for full restitution and probation. Margaret's response was polite and definitive. No. What the DA ultimately accepted was a plea to felony fraud and financial exploitation of an elderly person. Lawrence received 3 years of incarceration and 7 years of probation. Full restitution of the $261,000, structured in payments to begin 6 months after release. His professional licenses were affected. His career in financial services was finished. The civil judgment came separately and confirmed the restitution obligation in a way that would follow him regardless of any later bankruptcy filing. Amber had cooperated with investigators. The charges against her were reviewed and not pursued. She had documented her own ignorance of the scheme, and the DA concluded she was credibly a victim of Lawrence's deception as well. She filed for divorce the week the plea was entered. She sent me a card that said she was sorry and that she hoped someday I could forgive her for not coming to me sooner. I keep the card in my desk drawer. I don't know yet what I think about forgiveness in that direction. I think she was afraid, and that fear makes people do things, or not do things they regret. I understand that better than I want to. The night after the sentencing, Craig and I drove out to a diner we'd been going to since the boys were young. Vinyl booths, pie under a glass dome on the counter, coffee that came in a ceramic mug without being asked. Ruth had loved this place. We brought the boys here after Little League games, after school plays, after the older one's high school graduation. We sat in the booth we always sat in and ordered the same things we always ordered. And for a while we just ate without talking about any of it. How are you actually doing? Craig asked eventually. I thought about it. I won, I said. And I feel like I lost, both of those things at the same time. Craig nodded slowly. Yeah. Winning against your own son isn't something you celebrate. It's something you survive. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the parking lot lights had come on in the early dark of November. Mom would have known, he said. Not accusatory, just true. Your mother knew people, I said. She would have seen it earlier. She would have said something to me when I still had time to head it off without it becoming what it became. She would have found a way to get through to Lawrence, too. Probably. That was the thing about Ruth. She could tell the truth to people who didn't want to hear it and somehow leave them feeling like they've been cared for. I never figured out how she did that. Some people are just built that way. We sat there until the coffee went cold and the pie was gone, and the waitress had refilled our mugs twice. Then we drove home to the dark Pennsylvania roads, and I thought about the 41 years I'd been driving this route, and how different everything looked now, and how it was still somehow the same. I put the house on the market in February, not because I had to. The restitution order meant the money would be recovered, though slowly, but because I was ready for something different. 38 years in that house, and I knew every creak in the floorboards, every draft that came in at the kitchen window, every way the light moved through the rooms across the seasons. Ruth was in those walls in a way I loved, and that also made it hard to breathe sometimes. A young couple bought it. They had a toddler and another one coming, and they walked to the rooms looking at everything with the particular hunger of people who can see a future in a space that you see a past. The husband shook my hand at closing and said they'd take care of it. I believed him. People usually mean that when they say it. I found a house on the other side of town, smaller, single floor, with a detached garage twice the size of the old one. The garage sold me. You can't do real work in a cramped garage. I had 6 cars at various stages of restoration, a 60 Chevelle, a 72 Ford pickup, a small collection of things I'd acquired over the years with good bones and bad upkeep, and they needed room. Craig helped me move. He drove out from Phoenix again, borrowed a truck from a friend of his, and spent 3 days hauling boxes and furniture and engine parts across town. We put the cars in the new garage and stood looking at them lined up. And I felt, for the first time in a long time, something that wasn't grief or anger or the grinding weight of process. It felt like mine. My space. My life. Still mine. 2 months after the move, I received a letter. Lawrence's handwriting on the envelope. A return address that was the correctional facility's mailing address. I held it for a while before I opened it. It wasn't long. He didn't make excuses. He said he'd been doing a program inside, a financial restitution course combined with counseling, and that his counselor had encouraged him to write a letter, but that he wasn't writing because of that. He was writing because he'd had a lot of time to understand what he'd actually done and who he'd done it to, and that the understanding kept getting worse. The clearer it got, not better. He said he wasn't asking for anything. He just needed to say it once. He was sorry, and not sorry the way people say they're sorry when they want something in return. Sorry the way you are when you've looked hard at something terrible you've done and you can't look away from it anymore. I read it twice. Then I put it in the desk drawer with Amber's card. I didn't write back. I'm not ready for that. I don't know if I'll be ready in a year or in 10. What I know is that I'm not going to decide from a place of anger or from a place of sentiment. When I'm ready, I'll know it. Greg visits every few months now. We have a standing arrangement, first weekend of the month when he can make it, which is roughly every other time. He brings the kids when school allows. My grandchildren are 9, 7, and 4, and they think the garage is the greatest place in the world, which tells me I've done something right. The 9-year-old has started handing me tools when I ask for them. Not guessing. Asking what each one is for. Then, remembering. Last time he visited, he correctly identified a torque wrench without being prompted. I didn't make a big deal of it, but I thought about it for the rest of the day. The work in the garage is the same as it always was. You take something apart down to its components. You look at every piece and figure out what's wrong and what's sound. You replace what can't be saved. You put it back together with more care than it was originally built with, usually because you understand it now. In a way the original builder didn't. Then you turn the key, and either it starts or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you go back and look again. I spent 31 years applying that logic to bridges. I've spent the last several decades applying it to cars. I've been applying it, without always having words for it, to my own life. Some things can be rebuilt. Some things have to be set aside, until you know whether the effort's worth making. And sometimes you realize the frame is bent in a way that no amount of work will fully correct, and you have to decide what to do with that, honestly. Without pretending, I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years making sure things didn't fall down. I survived the loss of my wife, the betrayal of my son, and a year of watching something I'd built over a lifetime nearly get taken from me by someone I'd trusted entirely. The garage smells like oil and metal, and the particular cold of Pennsylvania winter seeping in under the door. The Chevelle is almost done. The Ford's going to need a new transmission, which is a bigger job than I originally thought. But I've done bigger. I have time. I have my tools. I have Craig, and Craig's kids, and a house that's mine in a way that nobody else is on the paperwork for. And I have, somewhere in the desk drawer, 2 letters from 2 people who hurt me and who are now living in the consequences of that, trying to become something better. Maybe someday those letters will lead somewhere. Maybe they won't. Either way, I'll decide that on my own terms, on my own timeline. That's the thing nobody tells you about surviving something like this. The victory isn't the sentencing, or the restitution order, or the judge's gavel. The victory is still being yourself afterward, still being capable of the work, still caring about the craft, still letting your grandkid hand you a torque wrench, and feeling something warm move through your chest when he gets the name right. Lawrence will be 51 when he's done with his sentence. He'll carry a felony for the rest of his life. He stole from his father and used his mother's name to do it, and that's the shape of what he is now. The thing he has to live inside. And me? I'll be in the garage. If you found this story worth hearing, I'd ask you to leave a comment below and subscribe to Honest Revenge Stories. There are more stories coming. People who fought back, who protected themselves, who refused to become what others tried to make them. Click the box on the left for the next one. Thank you for listening. I've been thinking a lot lately about the word trust. Not the legal kind, not the document you sign or the account you open in someone's name. The other kind, the kind that builds up so slowly over decades that you stop noticing it's there. The way you stop noticing the walls of a house you've lived in for 30 years. You don't see them. You just assume they're holding. That's what Lawrence was to me. A wall I'd stopped seeing because I assumed it was solid. What I've come to understand, not comfortably, not quickly, is that what happened between us wasn't random bad luck. It was the result of choices, layered one on top of another over years, and every choice had a weight that eventually had to be carried somewhere. Lawrence chose to take the first dollar, then the next. He chose to forge a signature. He chose to look at his father and see a resource instead of a person. Each of those choices added something to a structure that was always going to come down eventually. You can't build on that kind of foundation and expect it to hold. I spent 31 years as an engineer. I know what happens when the load-bearing elements are wrong. It doesn't matter how good the surface looks. At some point, physics wins. And I had choices too. I chose to stop asking questions because asking felt like distrust. I chose to hand over the paperwork because I was tired and grieving and it was easier. I'm not saying I deserved what happened. I don't believe that. But I understand now that trust without attention is just hope. And hope isn't a structural element. You have to check your load-bearing walls. You have to look at the numbers yourself sometimes, even when someone you love is handling them. Craig knew something was wrong 6 weeks before Amber called me. He talked himself out of it because believing it would have required him to see his brother clearly, and that's hard. I understand that too. Seeing people we love clearly, not better than they are, not worse, but accurately, is one of the harder things we're asked to do. We resist it because love and clarity feel like they're intention. They're not. Real love requires accuracy. Protecting someone you love from the truth of what they've become isn't love. It's avoidance wearing love's face. What kept me standing through all of it wasn't anger. Anger burns fast and leaves you cold. What kept me standing was the work. The garage. The engines that needed rebuilding. The logic of taking something apart, understanding every piece, and putting it back together correctly. That kind of intelligence. The patience to look at a broken thing without flinching. To understand it before you fix it. That's what I leaned on. It's what I'd built over a lifetime, and what nobody could take, because it lived in my hands and my head, and not in any account Lawrence had access to. If I learned one thing worth passing on, it's this. Your resilience is only as strong as what you've built inside yourself. Lawrence took money. He couldn't take 31 years of knowing how things work, or the relationship I have with Craig, or the sight of my 9-year-old grandson correctly identifying a torque wrench. Those things are mine because I built them, honestly, over time, without taking shortcuts. That's the only kind of wealth that's actually safe. I'm still here, still in the garage, still moving forward. That's not nothing.